Looking back now, I can see how everything went so wrong, but honestly, I still don't think I was the only one to blame. Charles likes to paint himself as this perfect husband who did nothing wrong, but he has no idea what it was like being married to someone who thought discussing our 401k contributions was romantic dinner conversation. Blake had been part of my life since college. We were in the same friend group, took classes together, and yeah, maybe we had a little chemistry back then, but nothing ever happened. When I met Charles junior year, Blake was actually the one who encouraged me to go for it. "He seems like a solid guy," Blake said, and he was right. Charles was solid, reliable, the kind of guy who showed up when he said he would and remembered to take out the trash without being asked. At 21, that felt like winning the lottery, but Blake never really went away. After graduation, he got a job in the same city, and when Charles and I got engaged, Blake was right there celebrating with us. When we bought our first house, Blake helped us move. When we had kids, Blake was at the hospital with flowers. Charles always made these little comments about it, rolling his eyes when Blake would text me or making snide remarks about how Blake seemed to have a lot of free time for someone who supposedly had such an important job. "Don't you think it's weird that he's always around?" Charles would say, and I'd get so frustrated because Blake was like family to me. He was my friend before Charles even existed in my life, and I wasn't going to throw away years of friendship just because my husband was insecure. Blake understood parts of me that Charles never even tried to understand. When I wanted to talk about books or movies or just random thoughts I had, Charles would give me this glazed look, like I was speaking a foreign language. But Blake got it. Blake would actually engage with me, like I was an interesting person worth listening to. The affair didn't start as an affair. It started as Blake being there when Charles wasn't, which was pretty much always. Charles worked late, Charles had weekend projects, Charles had his guys' nights and his golf games and his stupid fantasy football league that somehow required 3 hours of research every Sunday. I'd be home with the kids, feeling like a single parent, and Blake would text asking how my day was going. Actually asking, not just going through the motions like Charles did. It was Blake who remembered that I'd always wanted to try that new Thai place downtown. Blake, who asked about the book I was reading and actually wanted to hear my thoughts about it. Blake, who noticed when I got my hair cut or wore something new. Charles noticed when dinner wasn't ready on time or when I forgot to pick up his dry cleaning. But when was the last time he'd actually looked at me like he saw me? So when Blake suggested we grab lunch one afternoon while the kids were in school, it felt natural. Just two old friends catching up. We talked for 3 hours, and I felt more alive than I had in months. Charles came home that night and immediately started complaining about some drama at his office, not even asking about my day. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The lunch turned into coffee dates, which turned into longer conversations, which turned into Blake telling me how unhappy he'd been in his marriage, too. Grace was focused on the kids and her book club and her yoga classes, and Blake felt like he was just this accessory in her perfectly organized life. We had so much in common, all these feelings we'd been carrying around with no one to share them with. I knew it was getting inappropriate when Blake started texting me good morning before Charles even woke up, and when I found myself looking forward to those messages more than anything else in my day. But it felt so good to be wanted, to be seen as something other than Charles's wife or the kids' mom. Blake made me remember who I used to be before I got swallowed up in this suburban life that felt like it was slowly suffocating me. The first time we kissed, I told myself it was a mistake. We were in his car after another one of our coffee dates, and he was telling me about how beautiful I was, how he'd never stopped thinking about me even after all these years. When was the last time Charles had called me beautiful? When was the last time Charles had looked at me like Blake was looking at me right then? I should have stopped it there, but I didn't want to. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Not Charles's wife, not the kid's mom, just me. Blake saw me, really saw me, and wanted me anyway. How was I supposed to walk away from that? The hotel meetings started a few weeks later. I'd tell Charles I had to work late or had plans with girlfriends, and he'd just nod and go back to whatever he was doing. He never questioned it, never seemed suspicious, which honestly just proved my point about how checked out he was from our marriage. If he'd been paying attention, he would have noticed that I was happier, that I was taking more care with my appearance, that I was actually excited about things again. Blake and I would meet at this little hotel across town, and for a few hours I could pretend I was living a completely different life. We'd talk about everything: books, politics, our dreams, our fears. Blake listened to me in a way Charles never had, even in the beginning. With Charles, conversations always seemed to circle back to practical things: the mortgage, the kids' schedules, what needed to be fixed around the house. With Blake, I could be philosophical, emotional, complex. I could be interesting. I started looking forward to these meetings more than anything else in my life. Charles would come home and start his usual routine of complaining about work or telling me about some boring thing his coworker had said, and I'd just smile and nod while thinking about Blake. About how Blake had held my hand and told me I deserved better than settling for someone who didn't appreciate what he had. Because that's what Charles was doing, settling. He had this amazing woman right in front of him, and he was taking me completely for granted. When Blake touched me, it was like he was worshiping me. When Charles touched me, it felt like he was going through a checklist. The difference was night and day. I got careless, I'll admit that. I started staying out later, being less careful about my stories. But Charles never questioned anything, which just reinforced how little attention he was paying to me or our marriage. I could have told him I was joining the circus, and he probably would have just asked what time I'd be home for dinner. The night everything changed, Blake and I were at our usual hotel. We'd been seeing each other for months at that point, and I was starting to think about what it would mean to make this permanent. Blake had been talking about leaving Grace, and I was imagining what life would be like with someone who actually wanted to be with me. We were in bed, and Blake was telling me how much he loved me, how he'd never felt this way about anyone, when my phone started making noise. "Did you shut that phone off?" Blake asked, and I realized I must have accidentally called someone. I grabbed the phone and hung up, without even looking to see who it was. I was too caught up in the moment to think about it clearly. The next morning, Charles was waiting for me in the kitchen with this weird, calm expression on his face. "We need to talk about last night," he said, and my blood went cold. Somehow, some way, he knew. "I don't know what you mean," I said, but Charles just looked at me with this disappointed expression that made me feel like a child being caught in a lie. The phone call, Kat, I heard enough. My mind was racing. How much had he heard? What exactly did he know? I decided to go with a version of the truth that might be salvageable. "It was a mistake," I said. "A moment of weakness. It was just one time, Charles. It didn't mean anything." I watched his face, trying to gauge whether he was buying it. Charles was always so logical, so reasonable. If I could convince him it was just a stupid mistake, maybe we could move past this. "It was Blake," he said, and it wasn't a question. It was just, we were both going through a rough patch, and it just happened. It was like being back in college for a minute, you know? But it was stupid, and it's over, and I'm so sorry. Charles was quiet for a long time, just staring at me. Then he said, "I forgive you." I almost cried with relief. "Really? But Blake is not allowed in our house anymore. Ever." I nodded quickly. "Of course, absolutely. Charles, I'm so sorry. It really didn't mean anything." "I believe you," he said, and I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders. I believe it was a one-time thing. Charles was being so understanding, so mature about everything. It made me remember why I'd fallen for him in the first place. He was a good man, a solid man. Maybe this was the wake-up call our marriage needed. But as the days went by, I found myself missing Blake terribly. Charles was trying harder, I could see that, but it felt forced, like he was checking boxes on a how-to-save-your-marriage list rather than actually connecting with me. And Blake was texting me, asking when we could see each other again, telling me how much he missed me. I kept telling myself it was over, that I needed to focus on my marriage, but Blake understood me in ways Charles never would. Charles might forgive me, but he'd never really get why I'd needed something more in the first place. Blake got it because Blake felt the same way about his own marriage. 2 months after that awful morning conversation, Charles started talking about making changes. "I think we need a fresh start," he said. "New environment, new energy." He wanted to sell the house and move to a rental apartment temporarily while we figured out our next step. It seemed random, but Charles had always been the one to handle our finances and big decisions, so I went along with it. Maybe he was right. Maybe we needed to shake things up. The move was actually kind of exciting. Charles was being so attentive, so involved in planning our new life together. He kept talking about fresh starts and new beginnings, and I started to think maybe the affair had actually been good for us in a weird way. Like it had woken us both up to what we could lose. During the packing and moving process, Charles was giving away a lot of stuff. His motorcycle went to his friend Jake. The big screen TV went to another friend. "Downsizing," he explained. "We don't need all this stuff." He even gave his mother a substantial amount of money to help with some home repairs she'd been putting off. "Are you sure we can afford this?" I asked, but Charles assured me we were fine financially. Better than fine, actually. He'd gotten some kind of bonus at work, and he wanted to take care of family. The new apartment was smaller, but nice, and Charles seemed happier than he'd been in years. He was coming home earlier, planning date nights, really making an effort. I started to feel guilty about how much I was still thinking about Blake. Blake and I had been texting sporadically, but I'd been trying to keep it friendly and distant. Charles had forgiven me, was working so hard to make our marriage better, and I owed it to him to really try. But Blake was persistent, and eventually he wore me down. "I miss you," he texted one afternoon. "Grace is going out of town next weekend. We could finally have a whole weekend together." I stared at that text for an hour before responding. Charles was in the other room, humming while he organized his home office, completely trusting that everything was fine between us. And it could be fine if I just ignored Blake and focused on rebuilding what Charles and I had. But I missed Blake too. I missed feeling like the most important person in someone's world. I missed conversations that went deeper than grocery lists and weekend plans. I missed being desired instead of just needed. "I can't," I texted back, but even as I typed it, I was thinking about how good it would feel to be with Blake again. "One weekend," Blake replied. "Then we'll figure out what we really want." I told Charles I had a work conference that weekend. It was a lie that required elaborate planning. I had to research actual conferences happening that weekend, create a fake schedule, even give Charles the name of a fake coworker who would supposedly be rooming with me. Charles asked so many questions that I started to worry he was suspicious. But then he said he was just interested in what I was learning. He even called my boss to confirm I'd be out of the office, which panicked me until I realized my boss would just assume it was some kind of family emergency and cover for me. "Share your location with me," Charles suggested. "That way I'll know you got there safely." It was such a Charles thing to say. Practical and caring in that slightly overprotective way that used to annoy me, but now seemed sweet. I shared my location and then immediately started planning how I'd work around it. The weekend with Blake was everything I'd been missing. We barely left the hotel room, just talked and made love, and pretended we were the only two people in the world. Blake kept saying how much he loved me, how he wanted to leave Grace and start over with me. I found myself imagining what that would look like. Blake and me in some cute apartment, free from all the responsibilities and compromises that had been weighing me down for years. "We could do this for real," Blake said on Sunday morning. "We could actually be together." "What about the kids?" I asked, but I was already thinking about how we could make it work. Joint custody, fresh starts, finally being with someone who truly understood me. "Kids adapt," Blake said. "They want their parents to be happy." When I got home Sunday night, Charles was waiting up for me, which was unusual. Normally he'd be asleep by the time I got back from trips. "How was the conference?" he asked, and something in his tone made me nervous. "Good," I said quickly. "Boring, mostly. Lots of presentations about new software systems." Charles nodded. "Learn anything useful?" "Some things. I'm pretty tired, though. Mind if I just go to bed?" "Of course," Charles said. We'll talk tomorrow? The next few weeks were strange. Charles seemed different, not angry or suspicious, just distant in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. He was still doing all the same things, still being attentive and considerate, but something had shifted. I told myself I was being paranoid. Blake and I were texting more frequently again, making plans for another weekend. I was starting to think seriously about what he'd said about leaving our spouses and starting over. Charles was a good man, but he wasn't the right man for me. We'd gotten married young, before either of us really knew what we wanted, and now we were just going through the motions because it was easier than admitting we'd outgrown each other. 2 months after we'd moved into the apartment, Charles came home from work and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He had that same calm expression he'd had the morning after the phone call, and my stomach dropped. "I want a divorce," he said. The words hit me like a physical blow. "What? Charles, what are you talking about? I thought we were doing better. I thought you forgave me." "I did forgive you," Charles said, "but forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it never happened. But it was one time. You said you believed me." Charles pulled out a manila folder and set it on the table between us. "It wasn't one time, Kat. It wasn't even close to one time." My hands were shaking as I opened the folder. Photos of Blake and me at the hotel, at coffee shops, in his car, receipts, phone records, a timeline that went back months before that awful phone call. Evidence of everything. "How long have you known?" I whispered. "I suspected for a while before the phone call. After that night, I knew for sure." "Then why didn't you say anything? Why did you pretend to forgive me?" Charles's expression didn't change. "I needed time to protect our children's future and to document everything for the divorce proceedings." I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. The house sale, the gifts to his mother and friends, the move to the apartment. It had all been preparation. While I was planning romantic weekends with Blake, Charles was systematically protecting our assets and building a case against me. "This is all in the past now," I said desperately. "Charles, I ended it. I chose our marriage." "You chose to lie to me for 2 more months," Charles said. "You chose to elaborate on your deception instead of coming clean." "But I love you." "No, you don't." Charles stood up and walked toward the door. "And I don't love you anymore either." The divorce proceedings were a nightmare. Charles had documentation of everything, not just the affair, but every lie I'd told, every deception I'd constructed. My lawyer kept pushing me to accept Charles's settlement offer, but I was furious. Charles had manipulated me, had pretended to forgive me while secretly plotting against me. He'd moved assets around, given away things that should have been part of our marital property. I deserved more than half of what was left. "You're not going to get more than this," my lawyer warned me, "not with the evidence he has." But I couldn't let Charles win. I couldn't let him paint me as this terrible person when he'd been just as deceptive as I had been. So I refused the settlement and demanded we go to court. That was a mistake. In court, Charles's lawyer presented a timeline of my affair that made me look calculating and cruel. They had recordings of me lying to Charles's face, photos of me with Blake while Charles was home taking care of our children, evidence of elaborate deceptions that went far beyond a simple moment of weakness. My lawyer tried to argue that Charles's asset transfers were attempts to hide money from me, but Charles had documentation showing everything was legitimate gifts and sales. His mother testified about the home repairs, his friends testified about buying his possessions. Everything was above board, just strategically timed. In the end, I got exactly what Charles had originally offered, half of what remained after his pre-divorce financial planning. No alimony, no additional support. The judge made it clear that my behavior during the marriage had eliminated any sympathy I might have otherwise received. As soon as the divorce was finalized, I moved in with Blake. He'd finally left Grace, and we could be together the way we'd always wanted. Except it wasn't quite what I'd imagined. Blake's apartment was smaller than I'd expected, and he was stressed about money and custody arrangements. The romance and excitement of our secret affair had been replaced by the mundane realities of grocery shopping and splitting utility bills. A few weeks later, Blake came home looking shell-shocked. Grace got some kind of package today, he said. Photos, documents, everything. She's taking me back to court to modify our custody arrangement. Charles had sent Blake's ex-wife all the evidence from our affair. Grace, who had been relatively reasonable during Blake's divorce, was now furious and determined to limit Blake's access to his children. Why would he do that? I asked, though I knew the answer. Charles was thorough. He always finished what he started. Money became a constant source of stress. I'd gotten a decent settlement from the divorce, but I'd never been good with finances. That had always been Charles's job. I spent too much on furniture for Blake's apartment, too much on clothes to cheer myself up, too much on dinners out because cooking for two felt depressing after years of family meals. Blake was dealing with his own financial pressures. His ex-wife's lawyer was expensive, his child support payments were substantial, and his guilt about the kids was making him overly generous with toys and activities during his limited visitation time. 6 months after the divorce, I was calling everyone I knew asking for loans. My friends were sympathetic at first, but as my requests became more frequent and desperate, they started avoiding my calls. My family was dealing with their own problems and couldn't help. Even my mother, who had always been supportive, seemed tired of hearing about my financial struggles. Finally, swallowing what was left of my pride, I called Charles. "I know this is awkward," I said when he answered, "but I'm going through a really rough patch financially. I'm not asking for much, just enough to get back on my feet." There was a long pause. Then Charles said, "That's not my problem anymore, Kat." "Charles, please. We were married for years. We have children together. I just need a little help." "You made your choices," Charles said. "Now you get to live with the consequences." The line went dead. Sitting in Blake's cramped apartment staring at my phone, I tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong. I'd been unhappy in my marriage. Yes, but I'd never intended for it to end like this. I just wanted to feel alive again, to feel wanted and appreciated. Was that really so terrible? Charles acts like he's this innocent victim, but he never tried to understand what I was going through. He never asked why I was unhappy or what he could do differently. He just assumed everything was fine because I wasn't complaining loudly enough for him to notice. And Blake talks a good game about love and understanding, but when things get difficult, he shuts down just like Charles used to. The man who used to hang on my every word now gets irritated when I want to talk about my feelings or our future together. Everyone acts like I'm this terrible person who destroyed 2 families, but nobody wants to acknowledge that Charles and I were already broken. Blake and Grace were already having problems. I didn't create those issues. I just refused to pretend they didn't exist. Maybe I made some bad choices along the way. Maybe I should have been more honest, more direct about what I needed. But I was trying to find happiness in a life that felt like it was slowly killing me. I was trying to be true to myself instead of just going through the motions of being the perfect wife and mother. Charles got what he wanted. He got to be the victim, the wronged husband who handled everything with such dignity and grace. He got to keep most of our assets, got to maintain his relationship with our children, got to move on with his life while I'm stuck here trying to figure out how to pay rent. But I'm not the monster everyone thinks I am. I'm just someone who wanted more than a life of quiet desperation. Someone who thought I deserved to be truly happy instead of just comfortable. Maybe that makes me selfish, but at least I was honest about what I wanted, even if I wasn't honest about how I went about getting it. The worst part is that I still think Blake and I could have been really happy together if circumstances had been different. If we'd met each other when we were both single, if we hadn't had to deal with all this baggage and drama, we could have had something beautiful. Instead, we're both broke and stressed and dealing with angry ex-spouses who want to make our lives as difficult as possible. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just been honest with Charles from the beginning. If I'd told him I was unhappy, if I'd asked for marriage counseling, if I'd given him a chance to change before I went looking elsewhere. But then I remember all those years of trying to connect with him, all those hints and suggestions that went nowhere, and I know it wouldn't have made a difference. Charles is who he is, practical, logical, emotionally unavailable. He can play the perfect husband role when he has to, but he'll never be the kind of man who truly sees and appreciates the woman he's with. I needed more than that, and I'm not sorry for admitting it. I just wish the cost hadn't been quite so high.